Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to episode number 14 of the awesome Algo podcast. And today we do have a very special guest from Algorand Inc. and Kenyon, and she is here today to talk about some really exciting upcoming features in Algorand, specifically focusing around how the app development could be improved for, I would say, the benefit of entire ecosystem, of course. As always, I did my due diligence to prepare for the podcast. I would like to remind the listeners that this is not sponsored by any third parties. It is simply a way to highlight some very prominent builders, founders in the Algorand ecosystem, and talk about very exciting tech within the Web3 domain and domain of large distributed public ledgers such as Algorand. And with that, Anne, the floor is yours. I would like to start with a brief introduction. If we could talk a bit about yourself. How did you first discover Algorand, and what was your first experience within this domain, and perhaps some overlaps with a professional career in product management?
Well, thanks for having me, Al. Yeah, I came to Algorand as my first introduction to blockchain. Some people at Algorand reached out to me. My background, I was working as a product manager in a health tech, like health and wellness tech. But before that, I had been a data engineer. And before that, I studied computer science. And in my master's, I took some cryptography classes and had a very theoretical focused master's. So I think my combination of, the technical and theoretical background and my product management experience made me a pretty good fit for this ecosystem.
Interesting. It is, I would say I know quite a few product management folks, and it's certainly interesting that there's often a pattern that people come initially from engineering backgrounds, getting a lot of exposure and practical experience, and then later move on towards product management.
Right.
Since
Right.
you, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that is a common pattern. If you're an engineer and you start to wonder, okay, but why am I working on this? Am I sure that I'm working on the most impactful thing? Then you might start to be interested in product management.
Since you mentioned theoretical background in computer science, just a minor question that I often ask in the biography part of the episode. What was your first programming?
Well, the very first was Visual Basic, but then I started studying, in my undergrad in Java.
I see. And maybe just to briefly expand on the biography part, what would you say was the most exciting aspect about Algorand technology that initially sort of sparked your interest? You mentioned that you also started your journey into blockchain development, and I suppose this particular
Right.
domain of distributed systems. So what would you say was the main factor that determined this shift in career?
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest thing was when I was interviewing with Algorand, there was a very academic vibe, which, I come from a pretty academic background and family, so I feel right at home there. Yeah, I'd say that's the main thing. And along with that, there's academics are often idealists and they strive for excellence. So all that, really, I'd say that's what swayed me. Yeah.
Interesting. So I guess, to sort of shift the focus towards the main topic of the episode, if we could start with firstly having an overview of the new capabilities that are coming to Algorand. I suppose a right way to highlight the source where these new features are going to be coming from is the Go Algorand repository. that hosts various important aspects of the Algorand consensus, AVM, and other features. So what would you say are the main upcoming features that folks should be expecting?
Yeah. So it's been maybe 3 months since the box's release, the last big consensus upgrade, and this upcoming, we've got a lot coming out this next month, probably. The one big thing for developers is going to be a project that allows sharing of resources across the transaction group. And I won't get into it now, but essentially, like the foreign array limits of 8, we're going to help that be less of a problem. A second big thing is in the indexer realm, we're introducing a new tool called Conduit, which will help people run lighter weight data solutions for Algorand. And a third major thing is called Simulate. So this is a brand new feature that allows you to sort of run the execution of your transaction group without actually committing it to the blockchain.
I see. This is, I would say, on the Conduit and the Simulate endpoint side. It's certainly something I'm most excited to talk about on the episode. But yeah, let's sort of go one by one, so to give the right amount of time to each of those exciting features. Maybe let's start with the foreign array references. How does, I guess, sharing of foreign array references across transaction groups would affect blockchain development in Algorand?
Yeah, I would say that this foreign array limit of 8, which, for people who might not be as familiar, right? I mean, I assume the audience is mostly dApp developers, so you probably are familiar with it. All right. When you make an app call, you have to define the foreign accounts, apps, assets that you're going to be interacting with in that app call. And you have to do that, for performance reasons. And that's how, we need to know ahead of time what resources you're going to touch from the ledger. So this limit is a bit of a problem if you're trying to build a complex application that needs to interact with a lot of different apps, a lot of different assets or accounts. People do run into that limit. And I'd say this is one of perhaps one of the final limitations that have been getting in the way of okay, I want to do this and this is preventing me from it. There's no great way around this. Like maybe you can break up your app's functionality into multiple app calls, but that doesn't always work. So yeah, I'm expecting that there's a sort of a slew of use cases that people will now be able to do that they previously couldn't because of this limitation.
I see. And what would you say are those main use cases that in this particular case will be of the most use for the
Yeah, I think many complicated examples will make use of this. But I mean, if we just want to talk through an example that, maybe this was the first example that was brought up to me, in fact, is if you want to, there's multiple AMMs on Algorand and you want to get the best rate for your swap. So maybe you create another, sort of another smart contract that calls all the AMMs and chooses the one that gives you the best rate. But if it's going to call multiple other AMMs, for each one, you need to have that app ID. You need to have that, or maybe a liquidity pool token, and then the 2 assets, right? So you've already got 2 references for the 2 assets, one for each liquidity pool, one for each app. So that's already 6, and one for your first app that you actually created, if I'm doing my math right. So you're even just doing it for 2 AMMs, you're already basically running out of your foreign array references. So if you wanted to do with 3, well, you wouldn't be able to. Does that example make sense?
Yeah, certainly. And I guess Another thing to ask, at more from sort of product management side, what is the main flow for aggregating user feedback? Like if we take, for example, foreign array references in this case, is it something that is mostly a matter of listening to folks opening issues, say on the Go Algorand repository, or aggregating it through different sources on forums, Discord, or it's actually something that the team, I think, planned beforehand as part of the improvements that they themselves considered important?
This one is definitely a to improvement, right? I don't think we would have thought to do this, right? There are various limitations in the AVM, and and it was designed like thoughtfully at the beginning, but not every use case had come up yet, And some of these limitations, nobody's ever running into them. They're not a problem. And some of them, okay, when the rubber hits the road, okay, this is a problem. And we've already alleviated some of them, right? Like last year with the number of number of opt-ins per account, for example. So yeah, this one, how do we gather the feedback? It's a lot, yeah, paying attention on Discord, Slack channels. The DevRel team obviously are constantly talking to developers, so they also funnel like the most crucial feedback to us, things that just keep coming up. Yeah, and we obviously don't respond to every single thing, but once it starts to be a pattern, if one person asks me for something, I say, "Okay, thank you." Like, if it makes a lot of sense with our strategy, maybe we'll do it. But then if 2 or 3 or 5 people ask me for it, okay, it's a serious thing. We got to deal with it. Our ecosystem is still not that large, so like every piece of feedback is pretty meaningful.
I see. And maybe as an opportunity for, I'm assuming there will be a lot of folks coming from the engineering background who will be listening to this episode. What would you say is the easiest and the most optimal way for folks in the engineering community to provide feedback on features like this? Essentially, I understand that there may be different streams from which this information is
Mhm.
aggregated, but if Inc. had a preference over things like that, what would you say is the easiest?
Well, GitHub issues to the Go Algorand repository will
Mhm.
always get looked at. Not always, the day that they're posted, but, relatively promptly. But other than that, I think Discord is also a really good place. I mean, I'm available there and the DevRel team are, so and that's a good place. Discord's a good place because somehow it encourages more discussion for other people to pitch in, whereas GitHub, it feels very formal. Like if you're putting a comment, it's there forever.
Mm.
So whatever people prefer, but both of those methods are pretty good for getting our attention.
I see. I see. By the way, kudos to Jason Weathersby from DevRel. I saw some of the posts in the Discord with the kappaai integration that uses some OpenAI models, and it's pretty much very. I could imagine it elevates a lot of help for folks like Baranji who are extra active on Discord. So very very interesting application. I mean, there's a lot of issues with language models, but question answering on documentation is one aspect where they do quite good work, actually. So I'm excited to see how you guys will continue improving these things, because having sort of on-demand Stack Overflow for anyone hoping is
Right.
very important
Right.
for building, iterating.
I totally agree.
And all right, so let's
So
talk about. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I guess I didn't really talk about what's the group resource sharing, how it's going to
Mm,
work. If you
mhm.
want me to say a
Sure,
few
sure.
words about that. So, right, currently you only, for a certain app call, you only have access to the references that you put in that app call's, foreign arrays. Now with this update, you'll have access across the entire transaction group. So if you have two app calls together in a transaction group, they'll have access to each other's foreign resources. But there's one subtlety, which is that, as you probably know, if you put, Alice as one of the foreign accounts and then, USDC as one of the foreign assets, now you have access to information about Alice, information about USDC, and also Alice's USDC balance.
Hmm.
So that part will only be true for like within your app call. So in other words, if you put Alice and USDC together in the same set of foreign arrays, you'll have access to Alice's USDC balance. But if you have, a reference to Alice in transaction 1 and a reference to USDC in transaction 2, you won't have access to that sort of cross-product resource.
I see. And is it something that you foresee as a limitation that potentially could be improved in future as well, or something
I
that?
see it. I don't think it's a real. It's not really a limitation. It's more going to be a source of confusion.
I see.
So hopefully we'll find that this is the way it had to be designed for performance reasons. So hopefully, we'll find ways at the higher levels to sort of simplify that interface, because I expect that when people start using it, there'll be lots of questions around that. Yeah.
And one extra thing on the foreign array references before we move on. So I suppose once this particular feature is going to be rolled out, what are the main ways to interact with it? I suppose it's going to be something available for SDK. And how about some additional, perhaps utility or helpful functions in things like PyTeal, Beaker, and etc.?
Right. I don't think that has exactly been figured out yet. And I'm also, to be honest, not exactly sure what I don't know if it's just going to happen automatically as of AVM 9, that you just automatically have that access. So there's not really any changes to the interface, or if there are, I think at least like the ABI is going to require some updates. I think the ABI needs some revisiting in general, but some follow-ups to the ABI that include that, since now you'll have access to more things from different places. But yeah.
So let's talk a bit more about simulate endpoints now. Could you explain the benefits and the functionality of endpoints, and why simulate over simulated endpoints?
Yes. So simulate came about because we were frustrated with dry run. And when I say we, I mean, everybody. Right? Dry run is pretty useful. Well, I think, most people listening have probably tried using dry run, or maybe they use it as part of their daily workflow. But it's limited because dry run, it's sort of, it doesn't actually use all the real code from Go Algorand, like the same, evaluation path. And in particular, it doesn't have its own sort of ledger database to track updates to the changes. So that means that dry run can only handle one app call at a time, one transaction at a time. It can simulate, okay, one teal evaluation. But if you have a group of transactions, it won't, and say in transaction 1, you're transferring some balances, it's not going to remember that transfer when it's doing transaction 2. So because a lot of people design their apps with, transaction groups nowadays, not just a single transaction, dry run isn't good enough. And so this is where the whole concept started, was, okay, how are we going to solve this situation? Can we improve dry run? Do we need something else? And simulate is what we eventually settled on. And it not only sort of solves dry run's problems, it also opens some other use cases for us, which is pretty cool. So conceptually, simulate is similar, where you submit your transaction group to simulate, and then it tells you, yes, this transaction group would have been accepted by the network, or no, it would not have been accepted by the network, and it gives you some information about like what the error was, whether you were missing any signatures, and some other useful information for debugging. Make sense so far?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, great. Um, One of the cool things about Simulate is that it's an endpoint that you call on the algod. So, on your
Mm,
if you're running
I
a
see.
node, you can call Simulate, and you call it in the same format as you would the transactions endpoint to actually submit your transaction to the network. So you can, submit your transaction to Simulate, see what would happen, and if you're happy with it, submit it to the network, for example.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so does this imply that folks running big public algo explorers gonna have some busy time adding some support for it? Like
Right.
if
Yeah,
let's say
that's
you're sending it
yeah.
to AlgoD on, I don't know, Algo Explorer API, basically, would you have an ability to also browse it on some Algo Explorer platform, basically, for this case, or it's purely just a REST endpoint and you observe the response in this case, but explorers like this are not going to support it. But I suppose the app flow, for example, is something that might. But yeah, just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, first of all, Simulate is, each node runner can decide whether to support it or not. It's an endpoint that you can turn off because, people could be, they're using it for debugging or whatever. They might make lots of calls to it. And maybe you don't want your node's resources spent on that if you're running it for mainnet, for example, for consensus. Although you can, right, it might be useful to run Simulate against mainnet as well, depending on what you need it for. I think that's a great question about should the explorers, if you're using, a node that Explorer is managing, will they want to display something about Simulate? I think you're right that maybe it'll make sense for dApp flow, but yeah, that's up to them.
Yeah, I'm sure that flow is already having something like that implemented in mind. He's always doing some really exciting stuff for smart contract development in that regard. But to continue on this simulate, so would you say that, because initially I assumed this really sort of reminded me a little bit AlgoJig as well, because of the fact that another way to look at it is it will significantly simplify testing of contracts, because alleviating the need to wait for transactions to be finalized and things like that, quick and easy calls to just immediately verify the T logic. But in this particular case, are you foreseeing any additional infrastructure or like SDKs built on top of it that will also specifically target, let's say, unit testing? Although I'm not sure if in case of simulate you can call it unit testing, right? Because you will
Right.
have to communicate with the internet. You have to send the call to all.
Yeah, let's not get into the what kind of testing it is discussion, but yeah, one way I expect people will use Simulate that is currently maybe frustrating them is if you're using a local network for testing and you have to set up your test, right? You spin up many people for every test, they spin up a new local network using a sandbox or whatever. And then they have to create some accounts, deploy the apps, deploy the assets, opt in the accounts to the apps, the assets, make some initial calls to the apps to set up some global state or whatever state you want to actually test on. Okay, then finally, when all that's done, okay, you can make the call that you actually want to test. So having to do that for every single test can be, right, it's a bit onerous. Simulate, you could set up a certain state, and then you could run a bunch of calls against it using Simulate, right? For example, if I'm setting up an auction, right? I put it into a certain state where the auction is in progress, and then I can make a bunch of calls, bidding different amounts, maybe amounts that are too low, too high, not high enough because of the minimum bid increment, or make other calls, call every single method, but from the same state. So it's almost like enabling fuzz testing. I'm speaking outside of my domain of expertise, but that kind of thing, I think will be pretty powerful. And yes, we are adding like at least a minimum of SDK support for Simulate so that people can call it from their language of choice. Yeah.
Awesome. I wonder if Zeph is gonna do something with that, with his Graviton project.
With Graviton?
But yeah, and I guess to move to the final point for the simulate, and yeah, I finally got it why it's simulate, not simulated, because you're invoking a functionality that is simulating it. It's not an endpoint that is simulated essentially. But yeah, it's, I guess because of AlgoJig, I got a bit confused because initially saw a lot of similarity in the premise.
Right. I remember talking to Fergal in the fall, and I laughed about how we were developing very similar things because there was a need, right? There's a need in this area. And so hopefully now, people will have what they need. I mean, we simulate is definitely, in this first release, it's the base that, sort of opens up the field for more interesting sort of developer facing functionality, right? Because we've created this way to interact with the evaluator and the ledger that's not actually on the critical path, I guess.
Nice.
So now we could theoretically do things like, okay, you simulate, please evaluate this without checking foreign arrays at all. Or, please simulate this without the log limitation, the limitations on the number of logs I can do.
Nice.
Does that make sense? Like now we can start to sort of change the situation for simulate, because simulate, right? It's only running on the one node. So, and if you're controlling that node, you can do whatever you want with it. So why not have it evaluate it however you want, if it's useful for your debugging purposes or whatever.
Yeah, certainly makes sense on this. And so to continue on the features that you mentioned, unless there's anything else you wanted to add on the simulate.
Well, one more comment on simulate. One thing it enables is sort of reading contract state for free.
Oh,
I mean, yeah.
I see. That's interesting.
Right. Because, I mean, in any case, you can, get the contract state. I don't know. There's probably some Algorand endpoint, and there's definitely some indexer endpoints to get the contract state, but you won't know what, you'll get like a blob, and you won't really know what's in it, right? The encoding will be a mystery unless you go and read the teal for that contract or whatever. But using simulate, you could, if the contract has a method that, says like, give me the current price or something, you can call that method using simulate, and it'll give you the answer without paying a fee on the network, and without needing to decode.
And without the need to decode. Oh, okay. That's exactly something that I was looking for one of the things I was working on. But yeah, the decoding aspect is certainly quite exciting to try out. All right, so to continue on the features you outlined, let's talk about Conduit as well. So what is Conduit, and how does it, improve Indexer in this case for blockchain?
Yeah. So Conduit is, a new tool that the indexer has been refactored to use Conduit. So Conduit is sort of underlying the indexer going forward. And Conduit is a response to sort of the indexer. The indexer is a great thing, right? It's an end-to-end tool to get the blockchain data. And not all blockchain ecosystems have something like this. So I think it's been a real boon for the Algorand ecosystem. But because it's sort of also a one-size-fits-all tool, indexer has grown pretty large and bulky, right? Then if to run an indexer, your average developer can't necessarily afford to deploy that and maintain it, because it actually gathers like all the history of the data of the blockchain. And that's a lot, even though you might only care about a small part of that. So many people instead will use API providers, and then PureStake and Rand Labs will run indexers and you can query from them. The other sort of limitation of the indexer is, people will ask, okay, can you please sort the responses of the indexer? Why can't you change the API so that it allows me to sort? And the answer is, well, we can't really do that because it'll never be performant on the indexer. Like there's too much data that. So this is why we thought, okay, we have to re-architect this situation, make something that's a lot more flexible for people to be able to build their own data solutions, right? We also don't want to be we can't provide the data solutions that every single ecosystem person needs, right? Like Algo Explorer has very different needs than AlgoFi, than, the governance system, or, everybody has some different thing going on. So yeah, the indexer is architected as like a plugin system where you've got an importer plugin and then a filter potentially, or a processor plugin, that's what they're called, in the middle. But the one that I'm expecting people to use right away is the filter one, which allows you to basically throw away data you don't care about. And then an exporter plugin, which lets you put the data in the destination of your choice or throw it away if you want. So people can hopefully use Conduit and people have been asking, okay, Postgres isn't scaling very well for me. Can you please, support a different database? Like Cockroach has been one that people have been asking for. So now we could have a Cockroach exporter, and people who want to run that configuration can do it. Yeah, so that's the basic idea. Make sense?
Certainly, and this actually reminded me a little bit on one of the previous guests I had a while ago, a startup from New Zealand called Subquery, but in their case, they're aiming cross-chain indexer solutions, basically. I believe they're also support Algorand and had a good collaboration with a few folks in the ecosystem. But yeah, it's certainly awesome to the concept sort of applicable, but within indexer domain specifically, and within the domain of Algorand ecosystem specifically. But just to elaborate on the architecture that you mentioned here on on a very high level. So if I got it correctly, then Conduit is essentially is some sort of plugging sidecar on top of index that developers could configure, and the part in regards to whether you need to run your own indexer or not, if you could just elaborate on this a little bit. Let's say, maybe taking an example once again could be an easy way to explain it. Let's say we have Rand gallery that need to, for example, show top 10 most, sold NFTs that they had on the platform, and they need indexer specifically looking into their own NFTs that were minted on gallery. And they don't want to run indexer completely because it's very expensive, etc. What are the steps essentially to use Conduit in this case to have this custom capability?
Yeah, so there's a lot of options, but I think pretty much everybody will probably use, so the first part of Conduit is the importer, right? Probably everyone will use the AlgoD importer. That's what we're providing to just get the data from Algorand. And then what you do from there is kind of up to you. But the one sort of the simplest, perhaps, approach for people who don't want to deal with, changing or want to change as little as possible and just have something that works, but is more lightweight than Indexer, would be to use the Algorand importer, and then you add a filter processor, and then you still use the Postgres exporter, the same one that Indexer uses. And the cool thing about that is it allows you to use the same API as the Indexer. So you don't have to build your own API. You can, of course, change it if you want. But then with that filter processor in the middle, it allows you to filter if you're a RAND gallery, and what are your app IDs, you can filter to only track transactions that are interacting with your app IDs. So you end up with a much more limited data set. Does that make sense?
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah. But I guess if RAND gallery, wants to do some, more interesting analytics, then of course you can take the data from Postgres and aggregate it into some new tables and create some additional API if you want to. I think those are the options on the table as well.
I see. And yeah, there will be an extra question closer to the end of the episode, but wanted to also ask about the process for how the projects within Inc are named, because I see a little pattern for terminology that is related to physics with graviton and now conduit and things like that. But yeah, we can get to it closer to the end. But yeah, I guess this also makes sense given the, as you mentioned, very sort of academic approach within Inc and having a very bright minds working on the consensus. So I think there's a couple of additional features that we can quickly cover as well, if time allows. Could you also tell us a little bit about new macros in Teal? And I think there's also an information about Docker images that it's going to provide.
Right. Sure, I'll keep it brief. But yeah, we are releasing these new macros in Teal, relatively simple macros, nothing too crazy. So this will be, interesting to people who are writing compilers, of which there are many right now everyone's trying to offer a good language for Algorand development. So, PyTeal, Tealish, Reach, etc. They might make use of macros to make the output, right? Basically macros, you define, okay, whenever I use this keyword, it's actually these other things. So it's pretty straightforward. But yeah, and anybody still using Teal will also be happy. I think there are still some Teal users out there. Yeah, and then our Docker containers, I feel like this is a sort of a long overdue. I don't know why we hadn't done it before, but we are definitely taking a closer look at the node runner experience in general. But the Docker containers are intended both for, we're thinking about both node runners and dApp developers who need a quick way to set up a local network. And I'd say, we released our first official Docker container, and we're now taking feedback. We asked for feedback just last week, I think. So, and all this is moving towards trying to move towards an easier experience there. I mean, there's some, sort of related, we're also working on configuration profiles. These are small things that just make people's lives easier because we have I don't know, more than 100, I think, different configuration options when you're setting up a node, which is crazy. I mean, people don't want to have to worry about that. They either want to run a participation node or a relay node, which reminds me that I totally forgot a big point about Conduit, which is that you no longer have to run an archival algod to run Conduit.
I see. Yeah, that's certainly going to alleviate
Yeah.
a lot of configuration dependency, I suppose. Regarding Docker images, though, do you think this could also be like one of the first steps or building blocks towards having some sort of, one-click solutions for participation? And a big topic of discussions is relay nodes as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me ask you a question. What does a one-click node mean to you?
Well, I suppose speaking specifically about relay nodes in this case, giving various very long threads and forums, folks are talking about decentralization of relay nodes. That would be something that is oriented towards folks perhaps coming from, experience some engineering, but not necessarily hardcore development, where you gotta go over, have a very OS specific set of commands and going over many manual steps essentially to have the configuration. So maybe having some sort of even, I don't know, even like an Electron wrapper with simple, user interface that you download, and this runs a Docker Compose in background, and then this Docker Compose is what takes care of a lot of manual work for you. And then you just, do some configurations through this GUI of some sort, and pretty much eliminating those redundant manual steps as much as possible. Because at the end of the day, this is something that a lot of folks will probably do once per single
Yeah.
relay node configurations. I was
Yeah.
curious if
Yeah.
this is also something that perhaps could serve as a step towards.
Yes. I think it definitely is. And
Awesome.
I'm looking forward to us getting there to the one-click node. I think we're all thinking about it this year. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. And so I know we are approaching the end of the episode. I would like to move on towards some closing thoughts, actually. And since we already covered that part in regards to the, best places for the developer feedback, just wanted to highlight for the listeners once again, but I guess this is primarily towards folks who are working on projects within the Algorand ecosystem. As part of the awesomealgo.com website, there is also a little sub-platform called Ask Algo. Sorry, not Ask, but Help Algo. And this is basically a single dashboard that aggregates issues that in premise are contributor friendly. So for example, if folks working at Inc. on some feature on Go Algorand know about a particular issue that is contributor friendly, it's relatively easy to have someone from GitHub to hop in and, help a little bit. They can simply add a tag on that issue saying Algo help, basically. And this will appear on the platform, and then folks can come in there, and have a brief outlook on what are the features that are not necessarily too hard to wrap your head around and contribute to folks. Just wanted to outline this as part of that answer that you given. But going towards a bit more, high-level questions here, this is, I would say, a very interesting, but at the same time, very challenging time for entire industry in Web3, given a lot of things that happened last year. On the side of, the goals that Algorand Inc. has, 2023, what would you say are the biggest challenges? And firstly, for the, let's say, on the scope of Inc., and then what would you say is the biggest challenge for the entire Web3 space?
Boy, I wasn't prepared for this question. That's a doozy. Yeah.
We don't need to generalize towards entire Web3 space, but perhaps something that might be interesting to know from the perspective of Inc. itself.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, to be honest, I think we're starting, we are offering a really good blockchain. And so this is all my personal opinions, okay? But I think the challenge is most people don't understand very well what's going on in blockchain, right? They don't understand what the differences are between different blockchains. And I think we need to do a much better job of trying to explain that. And I don't think we're, we're we haven't been taking it upon ourselves to educate the world about blockchain and the differences between different blockchains, and like why does it matter finality of 3 seconds or whatever? That I don't think people grasp it, the impact of that, until they experience it. I mean, that's the easiest example, but there are more. Just earlier today, one of my colleagues was saying how when he was researching blockchains, he came upon Algorand. He said, the consensus algorithm is so smart and so brilliant, like so much better than the others in terms of its, the theory behind it. It's so elegant. Um, and yeah, it's true, but people don't appreciate that, and they don't appreciate the power of it. So I honestly think that might be, from my perspective, one of the biggest challenges, and I think we need to do a better job with, I don't know, more educational content that's tailored to just normal people, normal business owners, who don't have a huge amount of technical knowledge. We can't expect them to dive in and read our whole developer documentation website, for example, right? That's not practical. And then the reality is that if people don't understand very well, they're just going to go for the most popular options. So we have to be explaining it to them in detail. Yeah.
I see. I see. Yeah, I certainly agree with your point on this, and I'm sure there will be some interesting synergies in between Foundation and Ing this year, because on the Foundation side, I suppose overlaps with this a lot as well. And to expand on this a little bit, I guess maybe within that particular, educational aspects, um, you could even go further and generalize it for folks coming from Web2 environments, more traditional enterprise environments, who may have a bit more, not more, but way stronger biases than, let's say, a retail consumer that simply don't have time or understanding of the tech that is powering things like Algorand in this case. I guess educational here would imply educational for very different domains of people, including folks from the Web2 space. Like, I often like to say to friends of mine who do like AI or do more traditional software engineering, imagine a massive decentralized app store or a massive decentralized space that you can use for free, and your users are going to pay for it, basically. So I guess, yeah, I certainly agree for it. Like, applying the terminology for these things is certainly one of the aspects that can help
Yeah,
us.
that's a nice pitch. I like your pitch. Your one-liner.
And maybe to move on to, sadly, we didn't get a lot of question on the Ask Awesome Algo. I guess this overlaps a bit as well. Maybe I need easier ways to simplify what the platform is about, because there was actually a poll that I made. I was asking folks on the chat, how do you guys want to ask questions to guests? And there was options like Google Forms, things like that, or ask questions on
Mhm.
the blockchain. Everyone voted for ask on the blockchain, but maybe folks seeing the login button when they go on the platform get them a bit confused. But I'll try to simplify that experience. So we got a question on the naming of new features and products. How do folks approach naming? And is it up to an engineer to propose, or you guys also have a very academic and scientific, methodology to to come up with something like that?
I mean, does anybody have a real process around naming? I feel like the process is, someone suggests a name. Often the first name is what sticks. So you better be careful with what you propose. But if it's really bad, then we discuss it, and everybody throws out ideas until one of them makes the most sense. So I don't know, nothing crazy there. Why? I wonder if this person likes or dislikes our naming. I think the Conduit name was my idea. I think I know it was.
Nice. Nice. All right, then. So I guess with that, we've reached the end of the questions we had for this episode. Would like to, thank you for allocating your time for going over these new features. And perhaps as the closing thought, if this is already available, if you could provide an approximate timeline for when folks can expect these new awesome things.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I'm expecting things to, in the next month,
I see.
perhaps, to go to betanet. And once they're on betanet, we want everybody to be using them and giving us feedback before it goes to mainnet. So please use them.
And with that, I would like to thank our dear listeners for sticking with us to go over this in-depth overview of the features, and stay tuned for more announcements and new guests.
Right. Thanks, Al.